Hey, this is Donovan Keith, and in this video I'm going to walk you through why your textures might not be behaving the way that you expect. So in Cinema 4D, there are a few different ways that you can apply a material to an object. And so I've created this simple sort of multicolor gradient with a grid on it, and this is often called a UV test map. And I've applied it to this cube on the left just by dragging this over. And then by default, we get this UVW mapping projection. And on a standard cube, this would look something like this. So just applying this to a regular cube, we get something that's very predictable, right? And that's because what the UVs, or the relationship between the 3D polygons and the texture, is laid out very nicely. If we make it this editable, we can sort of see this. If we select the cube and then shift double click on this UVW tag, we'll get something that looks like this. And it's basically saying that the polygons in the cube look like each one of the quads takes up the full texture. Now, if we compare that to this cube, which is maybe something like you would get out of a CAD program, right, where your UVs aren't particularly well laid out, and each face or each part of this has a different looking texture. And if you open this up and double click, shift double click, what you will see is that we've got the different sides of the cube are all here, but they are laid out differently on this space. So that's why we're seeing these sort of like rotated elements here, why some of these are like very different scales, like this one feels blurry, whereas this feels good. So if you're having an issue where you're like, you've zoomed in and you've got the texture looking right, but then you dolly out and it's looking wrong, it's possible that the UVs are just very different on different sections of your model. And then this final one here, this is the same cube. It's got that same UVW setup here, this sort of bad one. If you take your material tag, for example, or my material, and apply it, change from UVW mapping to something like spherical, we'll see that it's sort of pinching at the top and sort of distorted on the sides. And if you click on this little texture here, you can see how this is being applied, is using a spherical projection. You can choose something like frontal, which will always texture based on the orientation of your camera. So that's actually can be pretty good for stills, but is very bad for animated things. Or you can choose something like cubic. And cubic is sort of general purpose, and it's doing a flat texture projection on each of the sides of your object. Works really good for architecture, things of that sort. And what you can do is, with your object selected with this sort of material tag in texture mode, you can move this cube around. You'll see that the edges are starting to sort of show, and that's because the texture is tiling. Now, on a seamlessly tiling texture, this would look fine, right? We can also come in here, rotate this if we want, which is quite all right. But if you just generally want to apply something without distortion and adjust the size of the texture, just take your scale and scale the texture here, and you should get something that looks pretty nice. And what you want to try and do is line it up so that there aren't harsh edges, but that's going to be sometimes impossible. And there you go. That is the basics of how you would use a cubic texture projection to fix these sorts of inconsistencies that you see in this object here. There's one other thing that we could do. Let me just see how easy this is to go over. I'm going to go to the UV edit layout, and I'm going to open up my material manager, select this one. So okay, we can see that. That's great. And then on my UVW mapping on this cube that currently has distorted UVs, if I go into UV mode, or UV edit mode here in polygon mode, so this is UV mode, this is polygon mode, both of those have to be on, and I go to automatic UV, and I choose like Control or Command A to select all, I can now do automatic UV and choose apply. And what this will do is it will look at my surface, and based on it, will try to take up the texture space as best it can, keeping things uniform and sort of non-distorted. Here I'll take a more complicated mesh and we can take a look at that really quickly. So let's say a figure. I'm just going to do something where I turn this all into a single object. So the UVs right now are actually pretty good. They're all split out across the different things. And the texture, if I was to apply it, is going to sort of tile and get repeated across each of these elements. But we do see that the scale of the texture changes, and for example, the ball here versus this torso here. So what we might do is choose automatic UV and then apply, and then it will automatically interpret my UVs to the best of its ability. And there might be some sort of rotated elements, but generally everything's going to be at least uniform size relative to everything else. Now, these commands are only available if your object is a polygon object and has been made editable. These commands are not available if you've got what's called a parametric object, where it's like a cube or a landscape or anything that's still in this mode where it's not yet been made editable. Okay, so there we are. That's my quick intro to texturing and how to apply your materials in different ways.